and welcome to the channel. Have you ever heard of the Silence Zone? Eric said when he first mentioned the idea. Little local rumor about a part of the forest where there is no sound. The planet began as another escape. Eric, Rachel, Megan and I needed a break from the noise, the constant hum of the city, the stress of work, and the endless barrage of emails and alerts. We did that for years by going camping, always chasing that sense of freedom that only nature can offer. But this time, we wanted something different, something truly remote. Rachel rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Sounds like a lot of superstition, probably something to do with acoustics or the natural sound barrier. A tone dripping with skepticism. Might be interesting, might be nice to actually experience. Some real silence for once. I added half-jokingly, although part of me was intrigued. A really quiet place sounded perfect for that. Eric had found the place, while scouring obscure online walking forums. It wasn't on any official maps, which made it perfect. A remote patch of national forest, far off the beaten track, where few hikers had ventured, but the main attraction was the legend that came with it. The idea stayed with us. The silence was as eerie as it sounded and had a strange appeal. A break from the constant noise of modern life. Just what we were looking for. The journey was set, and we were excited to disappear into the wilderness for the weekend. The drive was long but familiar. Miles of winding roads led us deeper into the national forest. The trees grew thicker as we left civilization behind. When we parked at the last trailhead, the car looked out of place in the dense forest. "This is where we go," Eric said, pointing to a barely visible trail. It was faint, cutting through the brush, almost as if it didn't want to be found. Rachel checked the phone one last time. No signal. Well, to being completely off the grid. We drove back to Bargear and started walking. The mood was light. We were laughing and joking about how far off the map we were going. And Rachel, the resident skeptic, continued to scoff at the legend. "Perhaps the silence will swallow us whole," she joked, grinning as she pushed through the undergrowth. Eric led the way. He moved confidently along the narrow path. The path wasn't marked, but it was clear enough to follow. For the next few hours, the forest felt normal. The leaves rushed in the wind, birds chirped in the trees, and our boots crunched against the packed earth. Everything was peaceful, exactly what we'd hoped for. As the sun began to set, we decided to make camp for the night. At this point, we were miles from the nearest road. There was nothing but wilderness around us. The air was crisp, and as Megan gathered wood for a fire, the familiar sounds of the forest played in the background, the gentle wind through the branches, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, insects buzzing in the undergrowth. But as we sat around the fire that night, the conversation slowed, and I caught the first glimpse of her knees. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. Rachel looked up. "What?" "It's quieter than before." "The forest," I murmured. Eric stopped and listened. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the faint buzzing of insects had faded away. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it felt like the forest had turned everything down. "We're probably just deeper in than we were before," Eric said, shrugging his shoulders. "This far out, it's normal for it to get quieter at night." Rachel nodded, but the tension remained. The silence wasn't total, but it was there, creeping in around the edges. The next morning, the group packed up and headed deeper into the forest. We walked for hours, the trail growing fainter, the trees closer together. The further we went, the quieter it became. By midday, we were walking in near silence, except for the soft crunch of our boots and the occasional murmur of conversation. Megan stopped at one point. Her face tightened. "Seriously, do you feel that? Like the air is pressing down on us?" I nodded slowly. The strange silence, the way their voices seemed to fall flat. Eric, the ever-steady one, waved them on. "We're approaching the area I read about. Probably just the geography or something, it'll pass." But as we walked on, The forest grew even quieter. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died. Even a footstep seemed to lose its sound, muffled by the thick, heavy air. By the time we reached the second campsite, the silence was more than just disconcerting. It was palpable. No wind, no animals, just the oppressive weight of silence, closing in around us. Okay, Rachel muttered as we set up camp, her voice barely above a whisper. Now it's getting weird. Eric gave her a tight smile, but he couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong. As we sat by the fire, staring into the void of the darkened trees, the silence, swallowing the sounds of the crackling flames. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed everything. And beyond the glow of the fire, there was only silence. The morning began like any other. We set up camp, shook off the night, and prepared to head deeper into the forest. I could feel the tension of the night before, but none of us mentioned it. Eric was his usual self, leading the way, talking about how great it was to be so far away from everything. Megan was right behind him, pretending not to notice the silence, pressing down on us with every step. I was at the back, watching her walk ahead. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it was just like the day before. The usual forest sounds, birds, wind in the trees, leaves rustling underfoot. But as the morning wore on, the sounds seemed to fade, not all at once, but little by little, until it was hard to tell if it was the forest. I was getting quieter, or my brain playing tricks on me. By midday, it was impossible to ignore. The silence was thick, if that makes any sense. You could feel it pressing against your skin. Your ears strained to pick up any sound at all. No birds, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves, just the soft crunch of our boots and the path. But even that was fading. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything. Megan spoke again, a voice that was too loud in the dead air. It's strange, isn't it? Like there's no sound at all. It's disturbing. Eric looked back at her, trying to keep things light. You're letting the Silent Zone story get to you. It's just the forest. We're probably imagining it, because we think about it too much. But even he could not hide the unease, creeping into his voice. I could feel it too. By the time we made camp that evening, the silence was undeniable. It was oppressive, like a weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. We sat around a fire, but even the flame seemed quieter than it should have been. The crackling was there, but it was faint, muffled. The fire barely made a dent. In the silence that surrounded us, Rachel sat across from me. Her face was lit by the firelight. This doesn't feel right, she said in a low voice. I've been in quiet woods before, but this is too quiet. Eric grinned. We found it, the Silent Zone. We should be proud of ourselves. Rachel didn't smile back. Neither did I. We didn't talk much after that. Every time one of us spoke, it felt wrong, as if our voices didn't belong there. I kept looking over my shoulder into the darkness, where the firelight didn't reach. It felt like something was watching us. I hadn't said it out loud, but the thoughts had been gnawing at me all day. The silence was doing something to me, messing with my head. It was too perfect, too quiet. We moved on. Eric, Megan, and Rachel were a few steps ahead of us, moving slowly. None of us wanted to admit it, but that sense of dread was growing. The silence wasn't just airy anymore. It was beginning to feel dangerous. The silence seemed to be closing in around us, every minute, suffocating any sound before it even had a chance. Megan slowed down and looked around. Her face was tense. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice sounding dull, as if it too was being swallowed by the air. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. Hear what? For a split second, I thought I heard it too. A snap, perhaps a twig breaking in the distance. Some kind of sound. That should have been impossible in this dead zone. But then, just as quickly, the forest fell silent again. We stood still, waiting, listening. Megan's eyes began to scan the trees. I swear I heard what sounded like normal noise. Eric looked back at us, confused. Maybe it's just an echo. I don't know, an echo. Maybe things are just weird around here. He kept moving, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. A few minutes later, something strange happened. We walked through a small clearing. It was a game, just a patch of ground where the trees parted slightly, and sunlight streamed through. The air here felt different, brighter almost. Rachel and I exchanged glances, noticing the change. Then, as I took another step, I heard it, my own footsteps, for the first time in hours. The crunch of my boots on the ground actually sounded like sound, real sound. Megan's eyes widened and she looked down at her feet. I stomped lightly. You heard that? Right? She whispered. Eric stopped and turned round, confused. What are you talking about? I tried it too, stomping harder this time. The sound was faint, but it was there. A crack like someone snapping their fingers in a room too big to echo. It was a lot, but after so much silence, it was deafening. I banged my canteen against the rock for good measure. The climb was barely audible, but sharp, cutting through the heavy silence. We all stood still and looked at each other, almost hopeful. But then the silence returned. The moment passed like a shot from a window, and everything went quiet again. Eric smiled weakly. He tried to pretend that nothing was wrong. Just the weird spot, he muttered. I picked up the pace. I wasn't so sure. There was something wrong with this clearing. For a second we had real sound, but the silence grew thicker as we walked. There were no more sounds, no more fleeting moments of relief. Megan and I exchanged uncomfortable glances. As we moved through the trees, we both remembered clearly what we had heard. Yet, neither of us wanted to say it out loud. It wasn't an echo. Something had let the sound through. Yet, we couldn't explain it. When we made camp that night, the silence was oppressive again. We sat around the fire, our bodies hunched. Each movement felt more strenuous than the last. The fire crackled softly, but even that sound felt faint, as if it didn't belong there, as if it were being muted. A little later, I noticed that Megan had fallen silent. Her eyes were fixed on something just beyond the firelight. Her body was taut, like she was ready to run. What is it? I asked. My voice was too loud, too sharp in the silence. She blinked, shaking her head. I thought I saw something over there. She pointed towards the trees, with shadows flickering in the firelight. Eric laughed, but it sounded forced. Probably just her imagination. It's dark. The fires cast shadows. It's easy to see things that aren't there. But I could see that Megan wasn't convinced. And to be honest, neither was I. I followed her gaze into the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows, stretching endlessly into the night. It's nothing, Megan said, finally shaking her head. But her voice was tight, and she kept looking towards the tree line, as if she expected to see something move again. I knew that feeling. The longer we sat there, the stronger it became. This feeling that we weren't alone. When we finally crawled into our tents, the silence felt even heavier. I lay there, staring at the fabric, straining to hear something. A breeze, a bird, even the sound of my own breathing. But there was nothing. We left early the next morning. But the moment we left camp, I felt it. The silence had deepened, worse than the day before. First, I thought maybe my ears were blocked or something. But no, the air itself was thick, heavy, pressed down on me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Rachel broke the silence. Is anyone else having problems? I don't know. Breathing. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Even my breaths felt shallow, as if the air wasn't reaching my lungs properly. When I tried to speak, felt like my voice was struggling to break through. Something thick, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound. Eric denied it, though he didn't sound convinced. He was a few steps ahead, leading the way, but there was a tension in his shoulders. It hadn't been there before. He was a few steps ahead, still leading the way, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. We kept moving, but it was getting harder. The silence was no longer just around us. It was in us, squeezing our lungs, muffling our voices, muting our thoughts. Every sound we made, even stepping on the ground, was swallowed almost instantly. I stopped for a second, to take a deep breath. Maybe we should turn back? Eric shot me a look. His eyes narrowed. We've come this far. We're close to the summit. Let's just finish the hike. Shall we? Rachel didn't say anything, but I could see the unease in her face. I felt it too, but we kept going. What else could we do? The further we went, the worse it got. The silence spread, following us, maybe even growing. Every noise we made, Eric shouted ahead to check the path. I stomped deliberately with my boots, was swallowed up so quickly it felt unnatural. There wasn't even an echo. Nothing bounced back. The sound just died. Rachel tried to talk, to make small talk, to break the tension, but her words felt distant, as if she was speaking through a thick wall of glass. Everything we said was muffled, felt like we weren't even there anymore, as if the forest had swallowed us whole. The more we walked, the more fear crept in. It wasn't just the silence. It was something about the way the air felt. It was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We stopped for a break. We set down our backpacks under the trees. Then Megan froze. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance. I saw it again. She whispered, her voice trembling. "What?" Eric asked, looking around. She pointed to the trees, her face pale. Something was moving. I followed, a gaze scanning the tree line. Nothing, just shadows and the faint rustle of branches. "There," she said again, her hand trembling. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. That's when I saw it. A shape, long and dark, moving between the trees, fast and silent. It slipped out of sight before I could get a clear look. But it was enough. My heart began to race. "We have to go." Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her lips moved, but there was nothing. Panic flashed through her eyes and she looked at me. I waved frantically to get her attention. I could barely breathe. It was as if the forest had taken not only the sound, but the air as well. Eric was standing still now, his eyes wide. "I think I see it." I nodded. We all had. We made our way to where we had last camped. We walked back to our starting point. That night in camp the fire crackled softly. The flames danced, but the sound was barely a whisper, barely a flicker against the overwhelming silence. We sat huddled together. No one said a word. What was the point? We couldn't hear each other anyway. Megan kept looking over her shoulder, and I didn't blame her. I could feel it too. Something was out there, lurking, waiting, watching. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low. "We have to go now. It hasn't attacked us, but we don't know what it wants. We have to go." Eric didn't react at first. He just stared into the flames as if in a trance. Finally, he shook his head. "We can't. Not in the dark. We wouldn't make it out." He was right, but staying here felt worse. I looked at Rachel, her face pale and drawn, and I knew she felt the same way. With the silence, it was so heavy, so complete, that we couldn't even talk about it properly. Crushed us. The fire continued to burn but gave off no heat or sound. We were alone with our fears, suffocating under the weight of silence. And out there, beyond the flickering light, something was waiting. I lay in my tent that night. I didn't sleep, couldn't. The silence had become unbearable. In my ears, in my chest. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was as if the world had stopped moving, as if time itself had slowed down. But worse than the silence was the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept staring into the darkness, sure that at any moment I'd see that shape again, slipping through the trees and watching us. I could feel it. It was out there, waiting for something. I woke up before dawn, although woke up doesn't feel like the right word, because I never really slept. As I finally unzipped my tent, the cold morning air hit me, but even that felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I looked over at Rachel and Eric's tents. Then my eyes fell on Megan's empty sleeping bag. I At first, I didn't take it in. It wasn't until I got up and walked over that I noticed the rest of her stuff was still there. Her boots, her backpack, everything. I called her name, but my voice felt muffled, barely breaking the thick air. No response. "Rachel!" I shouted louder this time, though it still felt like I was screaming and underwater. Rachel stumbled out of her tent and rubbed her eyes. "What is it? What's going on?" "It's Megan," I said, my voice cracking. "She's gone." Within minutes, we were all on our feet. We scanned the area, but there was nothing. No sign of her leaving. Her boots were still beside a tent. Her bag was untouched. No footprints, no broken branches. No sign of a struggle. Just silence. Rachel began to pace, running her hands through her hair. Her breathing came faster. Where had she gone? She wouldn't just leave like that. Eric stood still. His face was pale. Maybe she had gone into the woods. I don't know. Maybe she got up in the night and walked away. I shook my head. Without her boots, and she would have said something. We would have heard. But that was the problem, wasn't it? You couldn't hear anything in this forest. Not the wind, not the birds, and certainly not someone disappearing. In the middle of the night, we searched for hours, calling out a name. But our voices felt like they had been swallowed by a hole, barely getting past the trees. We walked in circles around the camp, searching for any sign of her. Nothing. It was as if she had been wiped away, erased from the world without a trace. The panic hit Rachel first. She paced again. Tears welled up in her eyes. I could see her hand trembling. Her breath came in short gasps. She could barely hold it together. Eric was trying to calm her down, but I could hear the trembling in his voice too. "We just have to stay focused." I didn't say anything. I was trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. But we couldn't stay here. Not after last night. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow, just another trick of the firelight, flickering through the trees. But as I stared, I realized it was moving, not swaying like a tree in the wind, but moving. A large, grotesque figure just beyond the edge of our camp. "Eric," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Do you see this?" He followed my gaze, and I heard him catch his breath. What the hell? He just stood there, still as death, watching us. His body was twisted. Despite his size, he made no sound. Not a whisper, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Rachel's face turned pale. "Oh my God!" The creature didn't move, didn't come closer. Just watching. Eric panicked, grabbed a stone from the ground, and threw it at the thing. But when the rock hit it, there was no sound. No impacto, no noise. Just the sight of it falling to the ground, as if it had never been thrown at all. The silence swallowed everything. My chest tightened. The thing didn't flinch, didn't react. It just stood there, shrouded in shadow, the darkness swallowing its features. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the dark. We stood there frozen. Neither of us spoke. What was the point? There were no words, just the weight of silence, heavier now than it had ever been, pressing down on us, squeezing the breath from our lungs, wrapped around our throats. Rachel was trembling, her eyes fixed on the spot where the had disappeared. "We have to go now." Eric didn't argue this time. Neither did I. We moved to the tree line, ready to follow the trail back. "I see something," I muttered, and they both turned to face me. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. A jacket, Megan's jacket. It looked like it had been discarded on a drying log. The sleeves were attached when I pulled on it. I yanked it up, and the log snapped with a sound that never came. Then I saw that it wasn't wood. It was the desiccated remains of Megan. She had been sucked dry by all the moisture and more. Dehydrated wouldn't come close to describing it. How that had happened in the space of a few hours was beyond me. Rachel's breath caught, and she stumbled forward. Her hands trembled as she reached down to pick it up. It was heavily saturated with something dark and sticky. Rachel backed away. Her hands trembled. "No, no, 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 no." Eric grabbed her shoulders and shook her gently. "We have to go, Rachel. Megan's gone, we can't stay here. You saw that thing. Still out there. We're going to die if we don't go now." Rachel's face fell and she nodded. Her eyes were wide and glazed over. Okay. We walked back in silence, or what passed for packing, when any movement felt sluggish, as if the air itself was resisting us. I couldn't get the image of Megan's jacket out of my mind. She was dead, and we had to get out before the same thing happened to us. Eric led the way, moving faster now, but it felt like we were fighting the forest. Each step was harder than the last, as if the ground was sucking us in. My lungs burned. I was struggling to breathe air that didn't seem to exist, and the silence was unbearable. I tried to keep up, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Rachel was ahead of me, her eyes wide open, her breathing erratic, but at least she was moving. I tried to call out to her, to tell them that we needed to move faster, but the sound died in my throat before it reached my lips. We started running, or at least we tried. It didn't feel like running, more like moving through a bad dream, everything disoriented, as if the world was working against us. Every step felt like it took double the effort, like the ground was pulling us back with every move. My lungs were on fire, my legs trembled with exhaustion, but I pushed forward, not daring to look back. And then I stumbled. My foot caught on something, maybe a root, maybe a rock, and I covered the ground hard. Not a sound, not even the thud of my body hitting the ground. It was as if the world itself erased the sound before it could happen. I tried to push myself up, but it felt like the silence was pulling me down, suffocating me. I called out for Eric, for Rachel, but nothing came. The silence swallowed my voice, and then I looked up. There was something in the trees right in front of me, a tall and grotesque shadow, watching me from the edge of the clearing. The creature had followed us, watching us fight, waiting for the right moment. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my body being pulled down, into the earth, into the suffocating void. I reached out, but Eric and Rachel were too far ahead of me. The forest was closing in around them. Eric and Rachel didn't realize I'd fallen behind until it was too late. Until it was too late. The silence engulfed me completely, swallowing me whole. I wasn't gone. Not completely. I could still see them, hear the faint whispers of their panicked breaths. I watched them run, stumbling through the trees, their movements slow and disjointed. They didn't know where they were going. The forest had twisted around them, distorting their path. And then they reached the clearing. They stumbled out into the open, gasping for breath. But it didn't matter. The silence was there too, thick and suffocating, pressing down on them. It was so intense now that it was becoming physically painful. I could see it on their faces, how they winced with each step and breath. And then the creature came into view. It was larger than I remembered. Its body was twisted and unnatural, its limbs long and thin, like shadows coming to life. It didn't need to move aggressively or chase them. Silence was its weapon, its way of crushing them without lifting a finger. Eric tried to scream, tried to make some noise, but his voice was gone before it left his mouth. Rachel fell to her knees, clutching her head, her face contorted in agony. The creature just stood there, watching, letting the silence do its work. Eric and Rachel made a desperate attempt to run, but it was hopeless. The silence was twisting everything. Their senses, their sense of time. They moved in slow motion, stumbling through the forest, which now felt endless. They didn't know if they were moving in the right direction. Direction? Maybe they weren't moving at all. I wanted to shout, to tell them to stop, to tell them to fight back. But I was gone. The silence had taken me as well. All I could do was watch, trapped in the void, as they ran off into the endless, suffocating silence. I couldn't bear to be left behind, so I pulled myself up with all my might and got one knee under me. A few heavy breaths later, and I planted the other foot. and with the effort of an Olympic lifter. I did the hardest squat of my life to stand. All the while, the creature just watched. On the edge of the tree line, I stumbled slowly at first, and picked myself up as fast as I could, which wasn't much. I was determined to catch up with Eric and Rachel. The light began to filter through the trees. Dawn. The pale glow of the morning should have been a relief, but the silence was suffocating, heavier than ever. Every breath I took felt like it was being stolen from me. Up ahead, I saw the arrogant Rachel barely moving. Every step was like wading through thick mud. The trees were thinning, but it didn't matter. The silence was within us now, a crushing weight that no mountain of daylight could lift. The air was thick in my throat, suffocating my screams before I could escape. It didn't matter how close the road was. It felt like the forest was fighting to hold us back. And then, Rachel collapsed. 1 second she was walking, the next she was face down in the dirt. Not a sound, not even the thought of her body hissing through the earth. Her face looked haggard, as if she hadn't eaten for days. Eric stopped panting and bent down to pick her up, but I could see it on his face. He was losing it. His hands were shaking. His breathing was shallow and desperate. He tried to raise them, but the silence seemed to cling to him, weighing him down, making every movement harder than it should be. We're not going to make it, I heard myself think. The silence wouldn't let go. Eric bent over Rachel, pulling a limp body towards him. He tried to get her to her feet. I staggered over. My legs were burning and I could barely hold myself up. We have to get her up, I gasped, though I couldn't hear my own words. Not a sound. He looked up at me, panic flashing in his eyes. Can't. His voice came out like a whisper, although I knew he was screaming. He put one arm up again, but it was like pulling against concrete. Rachel didn't move. For a second, I thought he was going to leave her. I thought maybe we'd have to make a choice. Leave Rachel behind, or risk being swallowed by the silence ourselves. But then I saw something flicker in Eric's eyes. Determination, or maybe just desperation. Either way, he wasn't going to give up. He grabbed Rachel by the shoulders, and I moved to help him. We lifted her up, but her body was heavy, too heavy. It was as if silence had wrapped itself around her, pulling her down into the earth. For every inch we lifted her, it was as if the forest was pulling her back. I looked behind me, expecting to see the creature, but the shadow was gone. This was almost worse. Couldn't see it, but I could feel it, closing in, pressing in on us from all sides, as if the silence itself was alive, ready to crush us at any moment. Eric was still dragging Rachel along, her body limp, barely able to stand. I wasn't far behind, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature was close. Couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, hiding just beyond the edges of my vision, watching us stumble through the trees like prey. Rachel fell to her knees with a thud that made no sound. Eric fell beside her, his face contorted in panic as he tried to lift her back up. But she was barely responsive. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. "We have to keep moving," Eric murmured, his voice shaking. He tried to pull her to her feet, but she was too heavy. It felt as if the air itself was pulling her down. I tried to think back to times when my body felt light, without the oppressive silence weighing me down. I tried to motivate myself mentally. We had been in this nightmare for so long. I struggled to think of a time when things were normal. Suddenly a thought flashed through my mind, of my last memory of clarity. The clearing, the one from the other day, when the silence had broken for just a second. It had been brief, barely noticeable at the time, but now it felt like our only hope. Sound had returned there, if only for a moment. I scanned the area, my eyes sweeping through the trees. Then I saw it, the path leading to the same clearing just ahead, highlighted by the rays of light, penetrating the canopy of branches. It wasn't far, just past the clump of trees. "Eric," I hissed, my voice barely audible. "The clearing is ahead. We have to go there." Eric looked up, confused and desperate. What are you talking about? We have to get away, not further in. But I didn't have time to explain. I grabbed Rachel's other arm and we half-dragged, half-carried her towards the clearing. The creature was approaching. I could feel it. The silence grew thicker with each step. My chest felt tight. My head was throbbing from the pressure. But I pushed forward. We had no choice. We broke through the trees into the clearing. And for a split second, just like before, I heard it, the faintest sound, of my boots crunching on the dirt, Rachel's ragged breaths, too loud in the oppressive silence. The silence was weaker here. Eric was panting, his eyes wild with fear. What are we going to do? We can't stay here. I laid Rachel down, using this place to let her rest. And as I put her down, I heard a loud rattle as she hit the ground. I looked down at the metal canister on Rachel's back. My hands were shaking as I removed it. The canteen, heavy and metallic. I didn't know if it would work, but we were out of options. I slammed it on the floor. The clang was sharp and clear, cut through the silence like a knife. It was faint, but it was real. A sound. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the oppressive silence seemed to recoil, as if it couldn't quite suppress the noise. Do it again, Eric gasped. He pulled a metal pot from his pack. He smashed it against his canteen. It made an echoing metallic clang. Again the sound cut through. Barely, but it was there. The air around us shivered, as if the silence itself was receding, and I felt the pressure in my chest ease slightly. The creature, it had been approaching. I could feel it, but now, it was being held back. I could almost sense it, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting for the sound of the fade. We need more noise. I murmured, my voice hoarse. I picked up a stone and threw it against the nearest tree. It made a dull thud, but it was something. Eric followed. He hit the tree with whatever he could find. There was an almost rhythmic clatter. Every sound we made seemed to push the silence back. Just a little further. Rachel stirred, barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered open. What is it? What are you doing? She whispered. We're making noise, I said, my voice shaking. It's the only way to hold them back. The silence wasn't gone, but we had weakened it. The creature was still out there, watching, waiting for the moment when the noise would stop. But as long as we kept banging and metal together, we were keeping it at bay. Move, I shouted, my voice cracking, but this time audible. We need to get to the road now. Eric and I helped Rachel to her feet. We staggered out of the clearing. I didn't dare look back. We kept moving, hitting rocks and trees as we went. The sounds are faint but steady. I obeyed the silence just long enough. It was a long journey, made especially hard by the constant need to make noise. But eventually, we broke through. The moment we stepped out onto the road, it was as if a veil had been lifted. The silence shattered. All at once, sound came rushing back in. The wind in the trees, the distant chirping of birds, our own ragged breaths. It hit us like a wave, disorientating and overwhelming. But it was real. We collapsed onto the tarmac, gasping for breath. We felt the solid ground beneath us. The weight of silence was gone, lifted. I turned to look back at the tree line, half expecting the creature to follow. But there was nothing. No shadows, no movement. Just the forest, still and silent. But not like before. Not that crushing, deadly stillness. Rachel lay beside me, breathing heavily, her face pale but alive. Eric sat behind her, his hands shaking, his eyes still wide with the adrenaline of the escape. We made it, he murmured, hoarse. We made it out. I nodded, but the feeling of dread didn't quite leave me. Even as I stared at the trees, we had escaped, but the forest, the silence, was still there, waiting, lurking just over the edge.